because like when Adam was born, our parents didn't know what they were doing. So, you know, they just had a couple of options. And then when I was
fine-tuned early gameplay experience.
Yeah. And when I was around, you know, they had a lot of big ideas now about what it means to be a parent and all that stuff. And it was very complicated.
But they're also still tending to all these initial things they started with Adam.
Yeah, they haven't closed all of Adam's storylines, you know. And then, you know, then Sam shows up and they're like, oh, just do whatever you want.
They're like, do whatever you want. I mean, here's the big point. You know, I don't know.
Butterscotch.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 442 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast, Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth, and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam. I'm the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam, and I'm a little horse.
Yeah, this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's November 10th. 20 Jubilee. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show.
Good job getting it in there.
I got it in. We'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thanks so much for letting us grab your money so we can help keep the podcast going. Man, we just got right through that intro. I'm so proud. I feel like this is going to be
I'm just holding it in.
I was just like chomping at the bit, as they say.
Adam and Sam they're both just vibrating.
Sam was also chomping at the bit because apparently he's a little horse.
Yeah.
That's where that comes from, right? The bit is the thing.
Yeah.
Between your teeth. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's when you're excited.
Yeah. When you said that, it just every time I hear that phrase, I just can't help but think like, can't we have a different word? Can't we have a different word for my throat? My voice is.
I don't know.
Raspy.
I like occasionally being a little horse. You know, I think it's fun.
I'm a little horse today.
You get, I get really into carrots. Just weeding around the town, you know.
It is a different word. Like it's not the mammal horse. You know, it's
sure.
It's the horse.
You got to really emphasize the A part when you say
you got to say ho arse.
Ho arse.
I'm feeling a little
maybe not.
today.
Maybe not emphasize it. Anyway, let's talk about some stuff. All right. First off, we've got a pretty cool thing happening in the studio this week, which is a small closed alpha test of Crashlands 2. We keep accidentally calling it an internal alpha, but to us, that means only people within the studio are playing it. So it's more of a closed alpha. So let's see. So we put a call out to Discord, right? And some other places. And we had an application and stuff. And we tried to get a diversity of people from like various backgrounds of what kinds of games they like and, you know, their experiences and stuff. And the goal of this playtest is to essentially have people play through all the stuff that is in the game at the moment and get feedback on everything ranging from balance to bugs to polish to UI, story. Is there anything confusing? You know, just kind of the whole
shebang,
the whole gamut of everything. So this is actually kind of like phase 2 of how we handle alpha testing and beta testing for our games. What we have done before so far with Crashlands 2 is these sort of one-on-one observational play tests, which is something that we like to do earlier in dev, where it's basically we will kind of as the game is evolving, we'll just kind of go out and tag people, just grab someone. Sometimes it's somebody who, you know, is more of a gamer and is more familiar with things, and that's a certain kind of test to see, like, just to get some feedback on, you know, people with that perspective. But then sometimes we also grab people who just don't really play games, and we watch them play it and kind of see how intuitive is this game to somebody who's less familiar with the you know, all the symbolism and verbiage of games.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and the idea is that we've been working on the game for a long time at that point, right? And
yeah, we can't unknow all the things.
Yeah, and so you need to periodically just throw somebody into the deep end and be like, what do I know that you don't, that I just can't tell that I know that you don't, right? And see what they do. And so even though you're getting a very narrow playtest experience because it's just one person's, right? And the stuff that the way they experience the game is not necessarily going to be like anybody else, right? But in the early phase, when there's a lot of just actual holes still, because of your own blindness towards what you already know, right? then it's a really good way to cost effectively discover stuff that's really hard to find otherwise. Because if you try to get it out of data from like a playtest or something,
You can't.
You just can't. You can't interpret that.
It has
well
to be
enough.
observational.
Yeah, you got to watch it. And the nice thing is you can just like literally watch one person. If you just like took one random person, a new person every month while you're working on your game and just watched them try to play it.
Yeah.
You'll end up with tons of really useful stuff of basically identifying your blind spots where you're just missing stuff.
Yeah, but importantly, that's saying this is phase 2 for us, because in that phase, essentially what you're largely testing is early, what they can refer to as FTUE, or first time user experience. So when you're onboarding someone into the game, are they able to actually enjoy themselves or get it? Is it too slow? Is the pacing weird? Or are there just system holes, whatever? And we largely crossed that bridge a while ago, basically last year, actually around the same time. Since then, and this is the interesting thing about kind of how we think about alphas versus betas, et cetera, is that for us, it's not necessarily about, it's not about like content completion, right? For those very early tests. We're very specifically testing, can we get someone onboarded into this game and get excited about it? This second one is essentially saying, okay, we have actually all of the systems in now that we had spec'd out. There is enough content in all of them that someone can essentially experience them. And we believe that the path now beyond that first time user experience is such that it can support someone playing for some amount of time, but we don't know just how well it works in that longer, say like post 2-3 hours sessions, right?
Yeah, and we also think that those holes of like our own blind spots, we think we've already filled by these prior playtests and stuff. So that now the focus is just, does this work? Because now now our intention is like fully represented by what the game has in it. This is how we get to ask the question, does our intention match reality? And the only way to do that is with a diversity of players, because that has to be representative of your actual target audience.
Yeah. And so one of the kind of fun things that happens in those early tests is, well, for starters, like we try not to ask people things when they're playing. We just watch, because there's always going to be that Hawthorne effect where as you're observing somebody do something, they're going to play it differently, and they're going to operate differently when they know that you're watching.
Wait, what's the Hawthorne effect?
That's exactly
that's just what it is. Like, it's a psychological principle where like people behave differently when they're being observed.
Is it the psychological version of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle?
It's essentially, yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so you have to take into account that, what you're seeing isn't truly real in terms of how that person would actually behave. And
they're putting on a performance, unintentionally, right? But
to some degree, depending on the person.
And also just the fact that it's framed as a test means that, like, I have this problem where if somebody sends me like a draft of something that they've written, and they're like, hey, can you read this and just give me some feedback, right? And normally if I'm reading something that I believe is finished, and if I come across something that's kind of confusing, I don't immediately think, oh, this is a problem. I might think, oh, maybe the author's going to explain this, right? But if it's presented as a draft and that needs feedback, the moment I become confused about something, I'm like, this sucks. Right? Clearly they didn't explain this well enough to me in advance, right? And so there's all these little psychological quirks about how people approach the gameplay that changes because of the context. You have to try to take that into account. You can't fully adjust for it because it's kind of unpredictable how it expresses itself.
Which is also like to be really careful interpreting the outcomes of playtests.
And so there's some interesting stuff like if like in Crashlands 2, there's quest dialogue and stuff like that. And one of the things that'll happen if you're watching somebody, that if they believe themselves to be kind of a slower reader, or if they're like a little bit self-conscious about that, they will feel like they're wasting your time as the observer, and they will start to kind of rush through the text, right? Or they won't spend much time reading tooltips or something because for some reason they feel like they would be making you bored.
It's like being a streamer, right? It's like, I don't want to spend time on that because it's not interesting to the audience.
So like watching somebody play is useful in some ways and useless in other ways, right? And you have to kind of think about how that might happen. And then other times we'll have stuff like with one-on-one tests. One of my favorites is we got feedback from somebody who had play tested the game, who one of their big points of feedback was that the character runs too slow. Okay. And we were like, that's a really interesting point of feedback because it's very specific. And the character running too slow always means something in relation to something else, right? Because like your character can be moving twice as fast, but still be perceived as too slow if there are things that are like chasing you down and you can't escape them or something like that, right? So we kind of look further into it. Like, why does this person think that the character's moving too slow? And we discovered that is because we had done a poor job of teaching the player about weapons in the game. And she had ended up spending a long time never crafting a weapon. And therefore, she was dying a lot to creatures because we had also accidentally just via some bad quest design, we had lured her to a dangerous area with no weapon, and she was dying a lot and spent a lot of time running back to retrieve her stuff. And therefore the feedback was the character runs too slow, when really there's a whole stack of things actually that led to that perception, right? And so when you're doing those one-on-one things, you'll oftentimes get suggestions, framed as like the game needs this.
It seems
balance
simple,
change, which if you did change that, it wouldn't actually have changed any of the experiences that this player had because there was some underlying other problem. So those are all the really interesting things that you can get when you dig into like a single person's experience. And you can do that stuff to kind of like polish things out and find those holes, right? So then once you kind of get past a lot of that stuff, then we get into this larger scale thing, which is more about generalities, right? Of like, are many people getting stuck on certain things or unable to progress or being confused by stuff,
or just falling off at some point? Like,
are they getting bored?
Yeah, they're getting bored. That's always the big one for me. And I think the kicker is that, like, when we look at games on Steam, the original Crashlands is, of course, a really high average playtime, but because you have people who play it for like 100 hours or something, right?
Yeah, they pull up the median average.
Yeah, but the median playtime is only about around 6 hours, I think, or something like that, 6 or 7 hours, which is considered very good.
Yeah, it's not bad, right? But
yeah, it's considered very good. But then if you look at something like a Stardew or whatever else, your median playtime bumps up to like 15 hours.
Yeah.
Right. And so the target for us is to be striking up into that sort of a range with players where basically the average experience goes much further at a baseline, right, before any kind of fall off happens. And it's large. I mean, the whole design of the game's been, the whole thing's just reconstructed to make it so that the whole adventure is just way more interesting the whole time, as opposed to kind of fading off a little bit. After a few hours. So
which does mean it's much harder to develop, because like making something much more interesting means a lot more choices and a lot more like parallel paths the player can take and a lot more flexibility in what the player can do. Of course, if you play a game through and there's only one way to do everything, and that's it, then you don't really have a reason to play it again or to experiment
easy to get bored,
further.
it's easy to get stuck. Right.
Yeah, it's like a cookie clicker kind of example, right? Like you're not going to be like, I want to replay cookie clicker because I feel like I could do things differently. It's like, no, you can't do anything differently. You're just clicking on a cookie. Whereas something like Baldur's Gate, which has just this infinite branching choices and stuff, you could play that game for 400 hours and still be coming up with stuff to do for the next 400 hours, right? And so, of course, like there's always going to be a fall off.
Yeah,
right.
Just like, can you move it because the game quality is high enough? That's to me what this test is about. And so when we go from like pre-alpha testing, and then it's usually this kind of first-time user experience, does even just the baseline mechanics of this thing make sense? Can people operate it? Moving into alpha, then for us is essentially saying, does the whole game design do what we need it to do?
Yeah, if we keep on doing this for the rest of the game, is that going to be good? Yeah.
And then beta is essentially saying,
we did it now.
We did it. Now we just want scale testing to find weird shit, do hardware tests, put it on all the devices we intended to be on.
Yeah, it's focused on where our intention didn't match reality, right? For some reason. Whether it's bugs or just things that are insufficiently explained, all that kind of stuff.
But what's interesting about this, this is our first time also working with kind of like more of a partner entity in the case of Netflix. And so the reality is that every studios have different definitions of, again, pre-production, production, pre-alpha, alpha, whatever.
It's important to remember that all of this is made up.
It's all made up.
There's no real standards.
Yeah.
And if there were, those would be made up too,
Yeah. So a lot of times people think about alpha as essentially the more of a time for bug testing than about necessarily like full scope systems play testing. And they would have rougher systems at this point than we do. it'll be the case that when the playtesters play the game, they're essentially playing what will be the entire first zone, minus like a handful of things like content. But it's polished. It all exists. You're not gonna.
Yeah.
It won't feel like you're playing an alpha. You know. What I mean?
Yeah, it should be basically the same experience that people have at launch with the.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I myself played it for 5 hours over the weekend to try to get a head start on catching any just last remaining things. And I felt like I had barely scratched the surface of what is currently in the game, even at that point. And I came away with a lot of notes, but they're game designer notes, not like I didn't have fun with X. Yeah, like it all worked as we hoped it would, and I had a blast, honestly. Like because we have multiple people making content for the game. And this is actually like another reason why I wanted to play it is because I'm working on I've been kind of shifting more into content work on the game, but the game is so big now and there's so many things in it that I myself haven't really
experienced a number of them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That it's actually been harder and harder for me to work on quests and stuff because the story of the game is like branching enough that I haven't quite seen all of it now. Right. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to play through it just to see all that stuff and get a better sense of where we're at in the game and kind of what's going on story wise and stuff. But man, like it worked.
Cool.
Like I had a really good time with it and I wanted to keep playing, but then also like the new WoW season is coming. So I also had to do some prep for the new WoW raid. You know, I got my second job, you know? Yeah. But yeah, so I'm very excited to see what the response is.
I think what's always funny too, heading into these playtests, is that because you're going to be showing it to players for, you know, not necessarily the first time, like we have shown it to other people before, but we're trying to get something out of it, right? And so there's always a rush. It's like a game jam in a sense, where like there's always a rush to try to get those last couple of things, either design wise, especially for me, like the art holes got to get filled, right? And those have largely been filled, but there's always a few questions like, oh, would I be able to get this?
Yeah, can I squeeze in this last little?
Yeah, can I squeeze in this extension of this system or this extension of content, this line of content, so that I can see if it will work? Because like that's what the whole point of the test is, just see if your thoughts about how to do X, Y, or Z are working. And so, you know, there's always that kind of last minute rush to get a few more things smashed through. And then we are doing it just on PC, so it's just on Steam because that's the fastest, easiest thing for us to update. You know.
Yeah, really, that's the other part too, right? Is it's also really easy to think when you're gearing up for a test of some sort. You always feel like you want to squeeze every last drop of information you could get out of that test, right? So you're like, ooh, we can also want to collect bug reports, want to see what people's hardware devices are, so we can get a sense of like minimum hardware requirements, those kind of stuff. And this is something that this time around we're just actively pushing against, and we're like, no, this test is very scoped. Its purpose is to test design and the early, or I guess basically the main gameplay experience that most players would experience, right? Yeah. That's its purpose. And we could say like, yeah, we could also test that on mobile. We could also test it. You know, there's a lot of stuff that we could do as part of that, but those distract from the question at hand. And honestly, if you're trying to, the thing to remember is everyone involved has finite time. You have a finite pool of players. Doing things at different scale gets you different results, right? So if you want to get a lot of like really intense feedback and like see what people are doing and see what people are saying and all that kind of stuff, you need a good size but still very small group of people. And you need to not have them be distracted by like, oh, this doesn't work on my phone or, you know, or whatever, right? We need to be able to deliver stuff really easily and quickly, right? So that we can adapt to changes over a literal weekend of a playtest, right? It's going to be very short. Versus if we're wanting to test hardware and make sure that like all of the inputs for different form factors feel good and all that kind of stuff, right? Then we need to hit a lot more people. We need to hit a lot more devices and see what happens. And so you don't really need that real time quick feedback of like everyone's talking about the stuff, whatever. You can rely more on just data, edge case reports, that kind of stuff. But to do that, now you need hundreds of people or thousands of people even, right? And so you just got to figure out what are your actual goals and just scope it tightly, because tests are always really expensive to run. They completely disrupt all the rest of your work,
but they have a huge benefit if you do them well.
Yeah, well, that's what I get at, which is like, yeah. So again, because we've tested the game multiple times now, so the question is like, why do you need to do it again?
And we have constant QA.
And we have constant QA. So we're actually always testing. So the question is like, why? Why bother? And the real answer is because we've only built the first essentially planned third of the game. So notably, the remaining 2/3 of the game are templated off of what currently exists, right? So it'd be very foolish to go ahead and like, I don't know, build the rest of it without checking, does that fucking work? And then you have this huge reworking problem later. Yeah. Or you do a bunch of work.
It's easier to address hardware and input problems and stuff.
Those are small problems later, compared to like, so that's the main reason why is essentially we're really going to be kicking into high gear with building out the rest of the game finally after this test. And we want to make sure that we're building the right thing.
There's kind of a running joke about games where like, you ever see that meme that's like the 3 segments of the drawing of a horse? Yeah. Where like one chunk is like beautifully hand drawn, like perfect detail, and then the second one is like just missing a lot of shit, and then the final piece looks like a 3-year-old drew it, you know. And like there's kind of this running joke about the experience of playing through a single player game where the first portion of a game is always so polished and so bug free and so complete
and well balanced, because it's also very easy to balance the beginning of a game and gets increasingly difficult as the game goes on.
Yeah, and then as you get further into the game, the bugs start to crop up, weird edge case things start to happen.
If it's a more open game, you have, as a designer, you have less knowledge of where exactly the player is going to be.
Yeah, the complexity of what the player could be up to just explodes.
Yeah, and you kind of, I mean, people talked about this with Baldur's Gate, where in retrospect, with all the time that I've spent playing it, I kind of realized that like it doesn't have a story. There's a concept called a story lemon with narrative, which is that things start simply. Things start at a single point, and then as they start to branch and become more complex, there's a lot more parallel paths the player can be pursuing at any one time. So that's where like, if you imagine the shape of a lemon, like the options the player has or the things the player might be doing become very large halfway through the game. And then as you get toward the very end, you have to wrap things up. So you need to start ending storylines and closing things off and whatever. And then the number of different experiences the player has kind of tapers back down to kind of a single point at the very end, right? So like, for example, in Baldur's Gate, you can do anything you want in that game, but ultimately you are going to fight the last boss
one way or another.
And then the game's over. Right. And so like, it's not like you can just retire and open up a shop in town and just become a shopkeeper now. Like that's not a thing that the game allows for at the end. Right. So what you kind of see is like the very beginning of a game, because it's easier to test, you get way more feedback on it than anything else. The number of things that can happen is, and the combinatorial complexity is lower. So that early game is very, very thoroughly polished. The ending, same thing. People will kind of like set up scenarios to kind of like as developer, you'll use dev tools to kind of like fast forward to these snapshots of like, all right, final boss fight has to be a big deal. The ending has to feel good.
All
so
lots of extra there.
Yeah, so lots of extra care and testing goes into that final bit. But then the stuff in the middle has a tendency to sort of
get a little loosey-goosey because,
it's sort of the oldest child, middle child, youngest child kind of dynamic, I don't know if that's actually true, but it was a good joke because I'm the middle child.
And Seth has the highest combinatorial complexity.
I do, yeah. I'm the fat part of the lemon. Because like when Adam was born, our parents didn't know what they were doing, so they just had a couple of options, and then when
very
I was
fine-tuned early gameplay experience.
Yeah, and when I was around, they had a lot of big ideas now about what it means to be a parent and all that stuff, and it was very complicated.
But they're also still tending to all these initial things they started with Adam.
Yeah, they haven't closed all of Adam's storylines, and then then Sam shows up, and they're like, "Oh, just do whatever you want."
They're like, do whatever you want. I mean, here's the big point. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, just try not to fall off of something and die or whatever. Yeah. Other than that, have fun. Go have fun, little guy.
It's true. It gets very loose in the middle, but I think it's also.
But also, that's where most of the stuff is, right? Because
it is.
This just definitionally, this is how it has to work. It has to work in this way, unless you have a completely linear experience, right? Where it's just one step in front of the other, like a game like Control, for example, or Half-Life, right? Where it's just like there's a map, you walk through it linearly. It's a linear set of experiences, right? And and even then it's still tricky because like how much ammo does the player have halfway through the game, right? Who the fuck knows? There's just no way to guess. So like is the game well balanced at that point when you go to fight some boss, right? Which is also why you'll notice in every one of those games there's just fuckloads of ammo right before every boss fight because they're like, we don't know. We don't know how much ammo you're gonna have.
Yeah. I don't know how terrible your aim is. It's been 6 hours. I don't know how many bullets you got left in the chamber. You know?
Yeah, there's always these cues like that. Suddenly you find ammo, or suddenly the game auto saves. You're like, oh no, so something's about to happen. Yeah, so we don't want to fall into that trap. Where like we have a complete first part of a game and then just kind of whatever. And so the reason we do it this way is because we want to make sure that what we are building the second and third act of the game around is an extremely strong foundation that won't require us to rework a bunch of stuff because reworking stuff in the middle of the game is much, much harder than reworking stuff at the beginning or the end, right? And
which is also where there's kind of a bike shitting component to that too, right? Where you find yourself attracted to fixing the easy stuff in the first part of the game or the easy stuff at the end because you don't have to think nearly as hard. It's much more obvious like, oh yeah, this is a problem because I know what the player experience is going to be at this point. It's pretty unambiguous. But as you get into the middle of it, it's so fuzzy. The cognitive load of like trying to think through what kinds of player experiences could be happening, trying to understand the full context of the game and what you could be leveraging and using and stuff. It just becomes so hard that not only is it just harder, like a lot harder, but also you don't want to do it, The beginning and end of the lemons are attractors that kind of pull your focus towards those things.
Yeah, and honestly, there's also this kind of for me as a player, there's kind of this weird psychological effect, which I don't know if you guys have this, but like I've noticed this when I've been playing like Baldur's Gate or even like RimWorld, Kerbal Space Program, whatever. It is an absolute blast to play the beginnings of those games because you have all these ideas.
Yep.
You're like, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do, and like as you progress, like,
but there's not very much you can do actually, right? It's like it's still very your choice.
There's not much you can do.
Narrow.
Yeah, the beginning is still pretty similar each time, right? But you start to kind of like drift what you're doing towards some goal to try to like do things a little differently than you did before and kind of see what happens. But then like as you progress further down that new path, the game just inherently becomes less interesting because you are now checking those things off, right? And you're kind of answering the question of like, wow, what would it be like if X? What would it be like if Y?
Like, it's like this. Okay.
Yeah. And then like by the time you get halfway through the game, you kind of think like, all right, well, I kind of have a pretty good idea.
Well, I think what's interesting is Crashlands doesn't, like to clarify on the language reason, because Crashlands doesn't branch on the story, right? It doesn't, as in you don't choose one path versus another and then sort of shut that off.
We have a little bit of that in some scenarios.
But currently we've only experimented with it in like kind of dumb places where it won't matter, but it's fun, right?
But it isn't parallel.
Yeah, it's parallel.
So I would still describe it as branching, but just not. It's in a way where all of the branches are accessible, right? And you can move backwards and forwards through the. Yeah. If you think of it, it's a veiny lemon. It's
a veiny lemon.
It's a veiny.
I'm not going to
think. You're just going to have to accept this.
I don't want that.
And where the blood can move back and forth.
Oh God.
That's kind of what we're dealing with.
Arteries and veins, I guess.
So I think what's interesting about that then is that it's that the route you take can be very different on any given playthrough. But like my style has changed so when I was younger, I used to have alt fever, as they called it, when playing a game like WoW or whatever else, which is exactly this, which I'd start a game, be pumped, play it for like, I don't know, 10 hours, 20 hours, be like, all right, I get where this is going, start a new character, in a slightly different place, etc., and just repeat.
Yeah, never finish the game. Never even get halfway through.
I think it's also, it's that, because I think I had the same thing, but for me, it's manifest in like, because the beginning of the game is all about you discovering the game, like how the game works and what's going on and what you can do and all this kind of stuff, right? And then at some point the game switches to being a skill thing where it's like now you take it's a mastery, right? Yeah, exactly. You're not in the exploit phase. And to me, the exploit phase is like now it's about you being good at stuff, which I like am inherently kind of disinterested in video games for whatever reason, where it's like I like exploring the world and discovering stuff. Like that's the part that I like. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And as soon as like this is like I just experienced this in basically all games. Like I think that's the part where I start to just get bored. And I'm like, I want to go experience it for the first time again. I want to go back to when I didn't know anything and have that experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a very rewarding period. When you're playing, right? Where like you just don't know shit and everything you see, you're just like, what is that? Yeah. Right? It's so fun. Yeah. So hopefully, you know, through this week's small closed playtest, we'll get some good feedback on what we can cinch up and ultimately, you know, our goal with Crashlands 2 is to make a remarkable game, which means something that people can talk about with each other.
Yeah.
They can have different experiences and different ideas, and they can share things and be like, "What? That's crazy! I didn't even know about that." Like that's the kind of thing that we want. And so we won't be watching people play in this test. Instead, we'll just be listening, right? Because we have a private Discord channel for them, and we will just be lurking and reading what they're saying. So I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, and if you as a listener missed out on the application because you weren't hanging out in the Discord, there'll be other, like we said, we're going to be doing future tests that are focused on other stuff, right? So there'll be other opportunities, but the best way to know about those is going to be through Discord because that's where we can do real time stuff. It's too hard to plan around the podcast schedule. Like, are we definitely doing? Because we also never know for sure. Like, are we definitely doing it next week? Because something else could happen. You know, kind of a deal. So get over to our Discord for future playtests.
Yeah. All right. Now we got one more thing to talk about, and then if time, we'll get to a question.
What you got?
All right. So we need to talk about Blue-Eyed Samurai via our mini segment, Nailed It or Whiffed It. So Adam, hit me up.
So Sam, you said you finished it, right?
I did.
Okay, so my wife and I just started it last night. We watched the first 3 episodes. I think we finished 2 episodes. I think they're like an hour.
Each episode is
long.
like an hour. Yeah, it's like a
they're significant. Yeah, and when we started the second one, we were like, should we start or should we go to bed? Because it was like that time and it's an hour, you know? And we were like, we just gotta watch it. You know? So, which tells you something, right? But yeah, Sam might have more things to say. And all I really have to say is super fascinating art style, like for their animation style. It's like this like 3D kind of vibe, right? So it's just kind of cool already. But the writing is fucking stellar because the one-liners in this movie from the villains and the heroes alike are just so fucking good. They just cut, like it's a samurai thing, right? So people are cutting each other up anyway, but their words are just cutting people off at the knees. And it's just so satisfying. And even when they're like, because of its historical context of this thing where it's like, it's basically about like xenophobia and racism and patriarchy and all. It's like, it's got all these like
all the themes,
pretty dark themes in there. Right. And so even the relative good guys still like have various like intense biases. Right. And so even the moments that are meant to be like kind of nice in some way, you know, if you just think about it for more than a second, you're like, ooh, wow, that was also actually a horrible zinger, right? It's just really well done, really fascinating.
I think if you're a fan of like Arcane, you know, with League of Legends, it's sort of reminiscent of that style. It's a little less, I don't even know what, it's a little less maybe painterly or something on the character.
Yeah, it looks less like a painting and more just like a straight up kind of realistic cartoon, you know?
Yeah, it's almost like
it's like Clone Wars. I think it makes me think of Clone Wars, like from a overall style.
Okay.
But it is extremely violent, extremely dark, extremely gory. There's lots of nudity and sex stuff in it. So it's like, it's
an adult cartoon.
It's an adult cartoon.
Or adult animated show.
Yeah, but it has some of just so the fights are just so fun and just unreal. And they just get more and more unhinged as the show goes on. So there's also one episode smack in the middle that is essentially takes place kind of like in a theater, or like it's essentially a theater play done in that kind of like puppeteering style that would have been actually present in that time. It's like kind of like early ages, like I guess 1700s Japan, I think, something like that.
Or 1800s, I think, but yeah, something.
1800s.
Yeah.
It's done in like sort of referencing that style, and it's just but then it's sort of in parallel with a story about the character. And they
do a lot of good parallel stories.
Yeah, but it's one of the most like art. It's just like, it's a good piece of art. Like I was watching it and I was like, this is really fucking good.
What's this on?
It's on
Netflix.
It's on Netflix? Okay.
Yeah. So, I think they nailed it. They really nailed it.
Yeah.
Would highly recommend, as long as you're cool with,
Put the kids to bed.
Yeah.
Lots of.
And it's very dark themes, you know?
It's like you get your Games of Thrones. Like if you're into Game of Thrones and you're okay with like that level of violence and sex stuff, like that's actually kind of where it sits, in terms of
and
like,
human
it's
horribleness. Yeah, it's all that stuff.
So make sure you know what you're going into, but nailed it. 100%.
Blue-Eyed Samurai. Nailed it. All right, let's get on to a question. This question comes from our listeners over at podcast.bscotch.net, where people can ask questions and vote for each other's questions. The highest upvoted question for today comes from BricksParts.
BricksParts,
which might be the name of like an auto shop, maybe something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Brick is a good name if you're running an auto shop.
If your name is Brick and you're not like some kind of handyman kind of job, what are you even doing?
Yep. Made a mistake.
BricksParts says, I'm a solo dev implementing forgiveness mechanics, but running into design challenges from situations where player intention can be ambiguous. I assume that in the process of implementing and iterating upon these systems in Levelhead, you came across similar types of issues, and I'm curious if you have any advice or tips on how I should go about developing and refining forgiveness mechanics in my game.
So
what's a forgiveness mechanic?
Yeah. Forgiveness mechanic is basically a way where the design of the game allows you to, it fudges reality as far as what your skill level is so that you have better time. So in the case of like Levelhead, a platformer, people frequently hit the jump button before they've actually hit the ground, as a good example. So if you implement something like a little buffer such that you capture that fact that they tried to jump a little bit before they actually can, and then you just make them jump when they hit the ground, nobody needs to know.
Yeah,
okay, it's like a white lie system, okay?
In the case of a precision platformer, it's pretty easy to think of all these kinds of cases, right? Not easy to address them, right? But it's pretty straightforward because the whole idea is like it's a reaction time problem, right? Which is the player's intended action versus their ability to just compute information coming in, right? And all of that fast enough, given how fast things are happening on screen, there's a disconnect there, and you're trying to make it so that, and you're trying to recognize that the fact of what is correct, like what the correct thing for the player to do, actually has to take into account the human physiology of the player and the psychology of the player. There's no such thing as correct in a vacuum, as in like if a player, the moment they touch the ground, that's when they get to jump, right? Like the game doesn't define that as like, you can say that's correct because that's how it works in the game.
It's technically correct, but it might not feel good. So is it correct?
It feels like shit.
Yeah, that's because it's not really correct, right?
Yeah. So the question sounds like it's about the fact that as you start implementing these forgiveness mechanics, there becomes you're essentially going from programmer land where shit's cut and dry. Your feet in the ground, good. You can jump now, to design land, which is what feels good.
Does it feel good? Yeah.
Which means you're going from concrete to fuzzy.
Yeah. And in the particular case of the question, they're asking, because then when you're in that fuzzy range, you're basically saying, you're trying to predict what the player intends to do and then help them do that, right?
Yes.
But what if there's ambiguity there? We're now in some part of that fuzzy space, they could be doing more than one thing. Then what?
Yeah. So how do you handle that? Seth, who has had to deal with this in Levelhead.
Yeah. So there's a few ways. I think one is to not implement forgiveness mechanics in a way that is universally applied in all scenarios.
It's always going to be context dependent.
Yeah. So for example, if the player is jumping upward and there's like a solid sort of like corner above their head, right? And they're close enough to it that technically you could kind of like implement a forgiveness mechanic that would allow them to kind of like scoot past it as opposed to just banging their head on it, right? Which is one of the things that I showed in the video for the GDC talk that I gave, where we basically shrink the hitbox of the thing vertically when you're jumping upward, right? But what if that thing above their head is a block that contains an item and they're supposed to hit it? And they're supposed to hit their head on it to get stuff out, right? So that's just one of those scenarios where you can add extra layers in where it's like, well, if hitting their head on this thing would actually be good for the player, then we can just count that and let them hit it. But as soon as they've broken that block open and it's no longer useful, we should assume they don't want to bang their head against it and let them scoot past, right?
So it sounds like the disambiguation approach is to say, what is the best kind of outcome given this nebulous context I'm in, right? And then give the player that outcome, right? And and the other part of the whole thing is consistency, right? Because if there's this kind of nebulous aspect, right? You identify what it is and like, why is it nebulous? What is, and if it is, like, there must be something different about this context and some other contexts where it isn't.
Well, so I think a really good one is talking about a case where what you are actually having the player do is two of the same thing. So it's not clear which one to choose. I think a good example of this is, let's say you, as a player, you leapt. Like, platforms are so useful for this thinking, but like you leap and let's say the player can do a wall jump. Okay.
Yeah.
And as you're coming down, you're basically landing right in the corner. Okay. So imagine a nice parabolic arc down to the corner of an area. So technically, as you hit that button, you could do a wall jump, or we could buffer it and you could jump off the floor.
Off the ground. Yep.
How do we pick in that case? Which one?
Well, I think there's an even further question there, which is should the player even attach to the wall in the first place, right? Because like so like for example, in Levelhead, we have a power up you can get that lets you sort of stick to a wall and you kind of slide down it, and then you can wall jump off of it. So there are scenarios where you can, for example, look at the player's inputs when trying to make that decision and see like what combination of buttons are they holding, and is that consistent with something that I would expect them to want to do, right? So like if somebody is pushing the joystick in the direction of the wall, then that tells you that like they're intending to stick to it, because actually pushing the joystick in that direction may not actually affect their speed or whatever, but it's like a thing that people do, and also people will pick up on that consistency, right? And then they'll react to it.
Yeah, because if you provide things that allow the player to disambiguate themselves, like players will also learn that over time.
Yeah. And so then other stuff like if the player's about to stick to a wall, right? But then it turns out that like, you know, they're only like a few pixels off the ground. And so it would be this weird animation where like they would stick to the wall and then very like slower than normal slide down just a few pixels and then stop, you know? You can still just let that happen, but it may make things confusing for the player in the sense that they may think that they were going to do a regular jump, but now they've done a wall jump because they hit the wall first, but just barely, you know? And so...
And these are the kinds of things that like you play literally... I was just playing the most recent Mario game, Mario Wonder, I want to say. And even like this is now Mario... Like they've been making these games as platformers for what, 40 years or some?
Yep.
Some wild thing. And even still, like I got the wall jump power up, and oh boy, it took me a lot of effort to disambiguate my own inputs to get what I wanted out of that.
Yeah. It's not simple, you know, because it is about psychology and what feels good. And
then it's about consistency so the player could learn.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what you got to do is like, as you're playing it, as you're watching people play, anytime you fail at something in the game, where, you know, you lose, you die, you don't beat the level or whatever, if it feels like you should have based on what you pressed or what you were like trying to do, that's where the problem is.
If you focus on trying to understand the player's intent versus outcome and their sense that there was an unfair disconnect there, then that's what can reveal to you where the ambiguity is a problem and where you need to figure out. And again, it's all about how do you is understanding like what is the full context of this ambiguous situation. And as Seth said, never treating any two situations, don't assume they're actually the same, right? Still dig in and figure out, is this actually the same as this other thing? And if so, why was it fine here and not fine here? Therefore, it must not actually be the same. Let me go find the context that makes this a problem, and then figure out how do I disambiguate it in the player's favor. Basically, trying to align what their likely intent is with the outcome. Right?
It sounds like either disambiguate it in their favor or provide a consistent, essentially control mechanism that they can
self-disambiguate.
Yeah. And ultimately the goal of a forgiveness mechanic is it's a blame optimizer, which is when the player fails at the game,
they should feel it was their fault.
Where does their blame? Yeah, where does the blame go? If they feel like the game was responsible for them unfairly losing, they would stop playing. That's not fun, right? It's not fun when things feel unfair. And even when things actually are fair, again, because the truth like, the
is
players
not the goal, right?
But also fair that's again a made up concept. There's no truth there.
The human definition of fair is completely unrelated to the human experience of fairness. The human experience of fairness is, was this rigged in my favor? If yes, it's fair. That's what things that feel fair are like, right? Things that are actually fair, like in the case of a platformer, would be if you press the jump button and you were not standing exactly on the ground, you should not be able to jump. That's fair. That's concrete. It's according to the rules, right? But if you hit the button before your feet hit the ground and we save that fact and let you jump when your feet finally do touch the ground, we have rigged the game in your favor. You did not actually do a good job of pushing that jump button on the right time, but we're going to just let it slide. Because it feels fair, right?
Is the point of the game to like ensure that you can only jump when your feet are touching the ground, right?
Exactly.
That's a dumb thing to try to ensure, right?
Exactly. Why would you do that?
Yeah, it should feel good to be jumping. Is actually the thing I'm optimizing for, and this is why the idea of like fairness there's no sense of like what is supposed to happen in the game or whatever, right? You actually just need to be fully responsive to the reality of what it means to play a game as a person with an emotional response to what's happening and with delays in human computation and reaction time and moving of a muscle, right? Because in the end, you're building a thing that causes a person to puppet their muscles and do things with their brains, right? And all of those things take time, and they take significant amounts of time. And if you don't accommodate for those at all, then you're trying to simulate a reality that doesn't exist.
Yeah. Well, you're building a simulation instead of.
But you're not even building a simulation, because you're building a simulation of, it's like you're trying to build a simulation where the character in the game is the character, not the player who's puppeting the character, right? Because the problem is that in a game, there's a player puppeting a character, and therefore there's an extra delay in processing and moving things, right? And you have to account for that.
Well, I will say we do this in Crashlands 2 as an example, which is that there's the combat system in Crashlands 2. You can juke out of danger, whatever else, and the enemies always put down telegraphs for where their stuff is about to hit, right? So if I'm launching someone's, say, vomiting a bomb at you, as they do, as one does,
of course,
then
you're going to get somebody with a bomb.
Exactly. Yep. Then you're going to see a big red circle that you got to stay out of. But it's not true in the sense that, like, you could be what looks like kind of in there.
Yeah, well, because what does it mean for you to be in there, right?
Yeah.
That's a made-up idea. It's like it doesn't mean anything specifically.
And so, importantly, we have to we make it so that while it's the case that the player has, like, their own hitbox, and when the player is trying to hit stuff with their telegraphs, we use basically what is the most generous interpretation of the enemies.
Your hitbox is very small, and the enemy's hitbox is quite inflated.
And again, it's one of those things where it's like, it's all rigged so you can feel like you're doing a good job, because the point is to deliver a good time, not a truth.
Yeah. And like, there's a something like this that like, I understand it, but it just drives me so insane is in Baldur's Gate, you're in turn-based. You probably experienced the same. Your characters have a certain amount of movement per turn. Some of your characters are melee characters, right? And they have to be very close to an enemy. And there are times where you will use up your movement on a turn, and you will be like
perceptibly, yes, it looks like you should be able to hit this fucking person.
You'll see the circle around their feet that shows the range that you have to get into for melee, and your character will have 1 foot in that circle.
Yep.
Right. But like the center of their hitbox is like a millimeter out of the circle, and you cannot hit them.
No,
you'll have like a sword that's like 4 feet long, and your character is like an arm's length from them.
But that's also why I want to really like push that idea of like, it's not that the game is being technically correct here, right? Because the center of the sprite or whatever, like the single pixel, it's not true that's what defines where you are in space, right? That's not true. It can't be true. But it's also not true that like your foot going over a line like means that you're in that space or whatever, right? That's not true either. Those things aren't. There are things that can be inherently true or false, right? And that's why the focus has to be on how does the design meet player expectation? Because a player, as you're saying, is like Seth, you never would have in a million years even noticed this if when your foot was over the line,
you hit him.
Then you never would have thought about it, right?
Yeah, because it felt like I was close enough.
Yeah, but now it's a thing that's in your brain. Is this thing that you remember now? Is this like unfair aspect that's frustrating and annoying?
But here's the funny part too,
game,
right? Which is that there's going to be circumstances then when someone else, because of this ambiguity that is not in the player's favor in this exact scenario, when an enemy comes up to you and you have the same kind of problem where they look like they shouldn't be able to hit you, but they can, right?
Yeah.
For other reasons.
Because the difference is so tiny that you can't distinguish it visually.
So it's one of those things where like what they should do is use like a tiny hitbox for the players, and then use a fatter hitbox that always includes the body parts of like the creature or whatever else, right?
But not by much, even just like 5%, But then on top of that, you can do a thing where as the player, your characters, if you want to initiate a melee attack and you're just barely outside that circle, you could do a thing where like during the attack animation, you could move the character very slightly closer, right? Like
Just
nobody
close
would
the gap a
ever,
bit, baby. Who cares?
nobody would ever notice, right? Just because it would be part of the attack animation. Nobody would notice that their character moved 3 millimeters, right? But like it lets you close the gap. It actually gets you in melee range for the start of your next turn.
It lets you
so you're
pretend
doing
like
weird
the
shit.
strict rules are strict rules. You know?
Yeah. So like there's a lot of different ways to do it. And like honestly, it's such like to me like that's such a small gripe because also at the same time I recognize like I have a certain amount of movement. I didn't get close enough.
Yeah.
That's how
Oh,
it
the
works.
blame is perfect, but it doesn't feel good, so it doesn't matter.
It doesn't feel as good.
yeah.
Yeah. And then it's even worse because like your ranged attacks will have disadvantage if you're too close to a target. And so you're at that point where like you're not close enough to hit them with your melee weapon, but you're still too close. And now you're doing shit.
It's
right?
dumb.
Like,
This is the thing. It's one of those places where the punishment for attempting to do the thing, and also because you can't tell if you're actually going to get close enough, right? Unless you
Yeah, that's the other part, right?
like when you move, you can if you're going to attack someone, you can tell that it's going to attack, right? But if
yeah,
you're
but
just moving-
sometimes when you do that, it actually chooses a strange path that can't get there, right? So but like if you've been playing the game for a while, you get into the habit of moving your characters yourself, like position them yourself so that they take the best path and then tell them to attack. But then even then, like they're
It's
slightly
a lot of
too
times.
far.
Yeah, and if the consequences are, oh, you can't use a bow because you're too close. You can't hit them because you're too far. Go fuck yourself. That's
Yeah, I
not
was like,
great.
that's the third button. Go fuck yourself.
Yeah.
I guess I'll fuck myself.
Great. Okay. Fine. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not good. But yeah, but it's,
not
like,
good.
it's all about that sense, correct? Because if you landed so that your toe was right, like the character's physical foot was like right next to
You
a
could see
visible
it.
circle, and you can see that it's outside the circle, but just there, you would think, oh fuck, I just missed that. Like I just missed that, right? But if your toe is right over, then that's
You
not.
better
what you
let me
think.
hit that.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
I'm
not
in
what you
there.
think. That's just not how that works.
Yeah. And track and field, if my foot goes over the line, is that still doesn't count, right? It's got to be like the center of your mass, right?
I think it is. I think it isn't a foot or something. Because when they do those,
know.
like the photos,
Well, that's probably why they have the ribbon, right? Because like your torso has to go through, right?
I don't think.
Which,
I
like-
think it's as soon as any part of your body crosses the line.
Yeah, I think it is. That's fine.
I think it works. It's a forgiveness mechanic. Because otherwise, I mean, that doesn't feel good. If you finish the race and you actually cross the line ahead of someone by your pinky toe, but their chest hit. Their chest
got a big beer
line
gut.
faster. Yeah, I'd be like, "What? I
Belly
technically,
gross.
I did it. Yeah, let me have it, man."
Yeah. So that's just what it's all about. I mean, there is no good answer. There's no solid concrete answer to forgiveness mechanics globally. It's all about the specifics of how does it feel when you're doing that, and can you come up with a way to solve that problem in a way that feels good in a consistent way that the player can learn how that works and they can predict what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I know
That's-
a lot of
that's
like
the rule.
a lot of game designers will kind of fight against this idea because they have the wrong sense of what the truth is. As in, like if your feet are on the ground, you can't jump. That's the truth, right? So that's one part of it, right? But the other part is like the sense of like what it means for a game to be difficult and all this kind of stuff, and especially because once you start adding these forgiveness mechanics, those just become the new boundary, right? That players will use. But for your average player just playing your game, they learn that in the fuzzy way, right? Where that just gives them a sense of like, oh, they did a good job, and they don't blame you, and that's kind of it. And you get in though to the hardcore speedrunner community, like this kind of things, right? Where they just moved the position of where the truth is to match where you moved it, right? But they know they did that, right? They're very aware that they did
exploiting
that.
it, basically.
They're exploiting it, right? And you as a developer can see that as bad, and you see that a lot, like the way that developers talk about this kind of stuff, right? Or if you're trying to argue against this kind of stuff, because you're like, well, then players will just do it there instead, and now I have to move
Slippery
it back
slope,
again. But it's a
baby.
slippery slope. But that's actually not the reality of the player experience. It's not a slippery slope, right? Most players will then have a much better experience. And then some players will now, quote unquote, exploit, right, those mechanics that you put in, except that what is the outcome of them exploiting it?
They get to have a good time. Or
They get to
had a
have a
great
good
time.
time. And they know that they're doing that, right? And everybody else can do that too. So even if it's in a multiplayer context or, a competitive context, the rules are actually still the same for everybody, which is the most important thing for fairness, right? Is that they are actually the same.
Yeah. And once you learn about those weird tricks, you can do them too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
which is fun.
if you don't want to have to be so good at stuff that you can do pixel perfect, machinations like I don't, You don't have to. It's fine.
You just don't have to do that.
You just
Choose your own level of. I like to use the term challenge instead of difficulty, because to me, if something is difficult, that means it sucks.
Yeah, I agree.
Like, to me, difficult and frustrating are just two sides of the same coin. Yeah. But challenging is like, yes, this
you
matches.
get to engage with it. Yeah.
Yeah. This is an experience that will be hard, but in all the right ways.
I think it also acknowledges because difficult feels like an absolute statement, right? And challenge feels more like it's about how you're confronted.
It's about who is,
because I think it's like any discussion I've ever seen with players talking about difficulty makes me just bang my head against the wall because they talk about it in these absolute terms. That's just not how difficulty works, right? It's always the context of how the person, how the person meets the thing creates a unique kind of challenge, and it's not universal. So trying to treat the thing as if it has like.
There's no capital T truth on these.
Yeah, there's no capital T truth on anything.
It's all wiggly.
Which isn't to dismiss anyone's specific experience, because of course, like if you like this game was really difficult, like that's true. Yep. It was for you.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
And if everybody says that, then now it's just true. Period. Right? Like it's just difficult for literally every person who's played it. But there's always going to be a subset of people who like there's people in the Baldur's Gate community who are like, hey, can we get like another difficulty tier because the hardest difficulty is fucking easy.
It's not enough for me.
But you know why it's easy is because people do all like the wildest bullshit to cheese every single boss fight, right? Yeah. And it's like, well, even if we ramped up the difficulty more, those tactics would still just work unless we kind of deleted some game mechanics.
And now it's less fun.
Difficulty, right?
Yeah.
And then it's not as fun because now, the game just, So I don't know, make your own fun, have a good time, whatever. Yeah. All right. Well, anyways, that's all the time we have for today's episode. We'd like to thank our producers Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, you can just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week. Goodbye.